Nostalgia is the sentimental longing for the past. Maybe a game is only as good as the first time you play it, when it's new and exciting. Maybe a game is at its best at these times, when it's original to the player. An assumption that gets thrown around a lot is a person's favorite Zelda game is the first one they play. Video games capture the magic of engagement with entertainment, allowing for meaningful interactions in a medium that can be anything. And nothing captures that magic quite like a Zelda game, especially somebody's first Legend of Zelda experience. At least, that's what I would say if I was nostalgic towards this series. I'm not. My favorite Zelda isn't the first one I've played, or beat, or 100%ed without a walkthrough. I don't have nostalgic memories for the Legend of Zelda series, or any of its titles. I like to think that nostalgia can enhance our memories, keeping those experiences of our youth in a positive light. And when I tackled Ocarina of Time, I didn't need this wind-up introduction. People have been looking to take a shot at that juggernaut for years. But out of all the Zelda games out there, none have made me more nervous to talk about than this one. It seems like the safest pick for the favorite Zelda. It started tropes and interactions that would be seen throughout the next 20 years of gaming. It used the most of its hardware to achieve a visual and mechanical status that has seemed to age way better than expected. It's from one of the most beloved series of all time, and one of the most beloved systems of all time. I'm going to be talking about one of the most famous video games around, with almost as much praise given to it as Ocarina of Time, but with way less of the hate. Is it a game that can live up to the praise and love from its fans, or should it be left in the sentimental past of nostalgia? Let's venture back into the era of the Super Nintendo and take a look at The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Starting off with the narrative, the story goes that an evil wizard named Aghanim has taken over the castle of Hyrule and kidnapped a bunch of girls, including Princess Zelda. Zelda telepathically reaches out to a young man named Link, who goes into the castle to rescue her. After saving Zelda, Link is told that Aghanim is trying to plunge the world into darkness by breaking the ancient seal over the Dark World and freeing the evil lord known as Ganon. To stop him, Link needs the Master Sword. He gets the Master Sword, and then he's off to save the maidens that were captured. Once all the girls are saved, their sage powers are used to open the way to Aghanim's tower. Link defeats Aghanim in the Dark World, and it's revealed that he was actually Ganon all along. Ganon runs away to a pyramid, Link chases him, the two fight, Link wins, and the day is saved. Most of the story is dumped on you by either Sasahara or by the girls trapped in the crystals. And I tried to care, team. I really tried, but reading block attacks after block attacks is just boring, especially when they say almost the exact same thing. Ganon used the Triforce to turn this land into the Dark World. Go stop Ganon, save all the girls, and get the Triforce. You hear that like 7 times. It's pretty hard to forget. Zelda games aren't renowned for their storytelling though, so it isn't something worth judging too harshly. The story is around to give context to why you're going to a palace and why you will eventually fight a pigman named Ganon. But what is worth talking about is how this story is kind of a template for future Zelda games. Zelda's got a problem. You got to do 3 beginner palaces to get the Master Sword, which then gives you access to the second world map. Afterwards, you eventually end up fighting at least 2 forms of Ganon, one as a humanoid and then again as a ham monster. All in all, the story is totally fine. It's better than having nothing, and it's better than having way too much. There's no need to have an overbearing story slowing down the gameplay. A Link to the Past gets right to the action and only ever drops its story on you before the first palace and every time after you beat a boss. That's pretty good as far as I'm concerned. There's no super long tutorial stopping you from getting into the game, and there's not immense amount of cutscenes and dialogue bogging down your playtime. A Link to the Past is top-down, like the original Legend of Zelda. This time though, you can walk in 8 directions, including being able to go diagonal. It's nothing special nowadays, but even so, it actually feels pretty smooth. Weaving around traps and projectiles isn't some frame-perfect impossible task. When it comes to basic movement, being able to whirl around in a circle is a pretty good thing. You get the Pegasus boots early on too, which allow you to sprint, but you can only sprint in 4 directions. While that is annoying, there is this cool design in the game that if you're running along an edge of a wall, you can basically follow the wall while sprinting without having to change the directions. Besides sprinting, you can also unlock fast travel in A Link to the Past by using the flute and bird. There's a side quest of sorts that you need to do to get the flute, but it's not that hard to do, and having fast travel is extremely useful. There are these sections numbered on the map which you have your best bird drop you off at. And this form of travel will be seen again in other games, like playing songs to warp to palaces or using tornadoes to teleport around the overworld. The movement through the world is usually pretty quick, especially after you get the flute. Zipping all around just makes travel fast and convenient. You get a lot of items throughout the game. Getting a magic meter, bombs, and boomerang pretty early on allow for quick bombable walls and early exploration. Most items allow for increased world exploring. Getting the Moon Pearl opens up the Dark World, the Hammer opens up several areas that were blocked, and using the Power Glove and Titan Mitts allow you to move rocks away to further explore new locations. After every palace, a little bit more of the overworld opens up to you, which is a pretty cool thing that items do in terms of overall game content. They basically act as keys, unlocking more and more doors of the overworld. My personal favorite item is the Cane of Samaria. I really like the generating of a block idea. It seems especially cool in a game where you need to push blocks on switches. There's even an extremely annoying puzzle in the Ice Palace that can be skipped entirely if you get the Cane of Samaria beforehand. Inside palaces, items aren't really used to solve too many puzzles though. Usually it's light a torch here, bomb a thing there, hookshot once or twice later on, and occasionally the palace will require you to use a specific item from its big chest to proceed to the boss room. Item interactions with enemies, however, aren't usually that interesting or engaging. They never really go beyond attack the enemy to deal damage. The difference between using the hookshot on an enemy versus the bow and arrow isn't that big, and unless the enemy you're fighting specifically needs to be slapped upside down by the hammer, hitting a bad guy with a hammer versus hitting them with a sword or even a fire rod doesn't really feel that different, at least to me. It might be a little unfair to expect A Link to the Past to have satisfyingly distinct items where combat is concerned, but I don't know. Until I got to the boss of Turtle Rock, I felt like there wasn't a point in picking up the ice rod. It just doesn't do anything except against the final boss of Turtle Rock. Which is funny because it's actually one of the only items that does interact with enemies differently. You can freeze enemies with the ice rod and then throw their frozen corpses around. But beyond that, there isn't really a lot of item interactions when it comes to combat. The item usage in palaces and for puzzles is fairly good, but it seems lacking when it comes to enemy interactions. Outside of the usage, you can upgrade some of your items, like the boomerang, shield, sword, and bow. They're all combat oriented, which isn't a bad thing, but upgrading them doesn't really change any gameplay interactions beyond the fact that they deal more damage. Arguably, the pots and skulls and whatever throughout the game can be considered items. You can pick up pots and throw them, and that is probably the most satisfying mechanic in the entire game. The boop sound effect when you pick up a pot and the satisfying weight that comes from the throwing animation and sound effects is terrific. And the pots deal some good damage, making them a viable strategy in combat. Low-key, this game easily has the best pot throwing of the whole series. I talked a bit about how items affected combat, but diving into a little more detail, you can attack in one of 4 directions. Your sword attacks actually have an arc to them, so they cover more ground. You also have a spin attack which circles Link. Now Link used to do these little stabby attacks in the previous games, and switching the attack to cover more area was a really good decision. There's less precision required in attacking, which makes fighting multiple enemies at once way less of a hassle. You also get throwable items like those beautiful pots and, of course, bombs. Bombs can be picked up and thrown to deal some heavy damage to enemies and walls. And you got the boomerang, which can actually go diagonal, but I didn't find it to be that useful in combat. Every other attack is in a straight line. You got arrows, ice rods, flame rods, hook shots, and hammers, which all can attack in one of 4 directions. Again, I talked about this earlier, but I don't think the item usage is anything spectacular, and because of that, enemies aren't that diverse in how you tackle them. I don't think combat is even that big of a focus in A Link to the Past, so the enemies you fight and how you fight them don't ever evolve much beyond hit a guy with a weapon or stun a guy, then hit a guy with a weapon. I do think that they handled most of the boss battles in interesting ways. At the end of every palace is a big monster boss, and these bosses for the most part are pretty good. The Tower of Hera boss though is garbage, and I don't care for the moth, and we didn't need 3 giant eyeball bosses, but everything else is fine. Like the Helmasaur King, Aghanim, and Blind are all pretty good. And you have enough items to play around with later on, which make these fights a lot more engaging since you're usually doing more than just swatting at them with a sword. It's disappointing then that the final fight against Ganon kinda sucks. He keeps darting around and you have to keep lighting these torches, which can make the fight feel more like you're trying to slap at a really annoying fly than fighting the bringer of all darkness. Combat overall isn't mind-blowing, but a majority of the bosses are a good time, and enemies in general scale up in HP and damage as the game goes on, so they never feel like a joke. All in all, I don't care for the combat in A Link to the Past, but I also don't think the game needed stellar combat or anything to really work. The overworld of A Link to the Past is solidly constructed. There are distinct locations which each take up a good amount of space in the world. There are also fairly clear paths and routes to get from location to location, and those paths comparatively have some good space to them. And while the overworld seems big, it is very manageable. If you want to look at it like this, you only need to travel 1 screen to get from Link's house to the marsh, or travel 1 screen to go from the Lost Woods to Kakariko Village. Then when you add in the flute and Pegasus boots, travel time gets even faster. It's a solid overworld which is pretty reasonable to traverse. While palaces and little shops are scattered all over the map, there are also a lot of hidden, off-the-road areas that contain chests, heart pieces, or items. And every time you get a new item, more of the world opens up. After the first few palaces, you'll get the Moon Pearl and Magic Mirror so you can interact with the Dark World. The Dark World isn't really as complex as it might seem, which is a good thing. At first, it might feel daunting, it's a whole new overworld to tackle. Really though, most of the stuff in the Dark World is either palace related or just involves you using the Magic Mirror at the right spot. You can leave the Dark World whenever you want just by using the mirror, but you can only enter the Dark World at certain warp points. The DW has a lot of barriers around it, either mountains that block the way forward or broken bridges or heavy boulders. So you can't go to every location at once, you need to find portals in normal Hyrule to lead you to the right sections of the other world. If I did a bad job of explaining that, 1, I'm sorry, and 2, the takeaway is that traversing the 2 worlds isn't that hard or complicated once you get the hang of using the mirror and finding the portals to the Dark World. Really, the world seems big at first, but honestly, once you get through it a few times, it kind of feels more like a model set of a world. Like walking into a Legend of Zelda themed escape room. Over in this corner is Death Mountain, then you take a few steps over here to the Zora's Waterfall. Then in this corner of the room it's Lake Hylia. Walk a few steps over here and you're in the desert. And if you take a step or 2 up, here's Kakariko Village. And this is probably due to the fact that the open world concept has been built upon over the last 20 years, making A Link to the Past's overworld seem more like a toy playset than an expansive, endless world. But there's a certain charm to this game's overworld. It's really colorful, it's fleshed out, and it's got a lot of content packed into its small size. There are several nooks and crannies that contain goodies. Granted, most of those nooks and crannies never get revisited. Once you get the Ice Rod, you never need to return to that side of the lake ever again. You don't need to visit the desert after you go to the 1 cave and beat the 1 palace, but that doesn't make the overworld bad, per se. In general, it has a lot of stuff, and the fact that the world opens up naturally over the course of the game means you don't really need to revisit these small areas. There are some nice details in the overworld too, like the animals that run about, the trees in the Dark World that track your movement, and that super awesome fish. That fish is great and beautiful. But the overworld is also full of enemies. I don't really understand why there are so many of these guys. It just makes traversing the overworld tedious at times. After you get a feel of where you're going and how you're going to get there, you gotta run through this horde of Ganon's goons. And that's when these enemies start feeling more like speed bumps that are just placed there to slow you down. All in all though, I've played in much bigger and more detailed worlds, but this world is just the right size for what it's trying to accomplish. There are tons of little things to find and experience, and managing travel between the 2 worlds isn't as complicated as it seems. The only real problem I have with the overworld is the number of enemies in it. It feels a little gratuitous to me. Besides that, it captures a good amount of Hyrule and represents all of its staple locations in a unique style. The palaces are actually pretty good for the most part. They've got good visual and design differences. The Light World palaces are straightforward with how they're designed. They basically follow a linear path. You'll get the big key, then the item from the big chest, then you'll fight a boss. For most of the palaces, the puzzles you'll come across are gonna be in the vein of something like kill all the enemies in a room, step on a switch, push a block, lift up a pot, get a hidden item, or light a torch with fire. Actually, a lot of challenge in these palaces comes from navigation and exploration instead of puzzle solving. Unlike later installments in the Zelda series, A Link to the Past wants you to find small keys right from the get-go. Palaces are full of locked doors that need keys to open them, and as the game progresses, so do the number of keys and locked doors and routes that are needed to progress through a palace. Eventually, you don't need to unlock every door or go into every room. Some palaces offer up multiple ways to get through them. After you get the hammer, the palace order is no longer linear, though the game does have an order laid out for you if you want to follow it. If you don't want to follow it, you can do the Skull Woods, Gargoyles Domain, or the Swamp Palace in any order you want. After getting the Hook Shot, Titan Mitts, and Flute, you can enter Misery Mire. And after getting the Fire Rod, you can go through the Ice Palace. And you can do Turtle Rock after getting the Cane of Samaria. You have to beat every palace to unlock the final one, but you don't have to follow the order of palaces that the game gives you, which is actually really cool because it makes the game non-linear if you don't want it to be. Like for me, I prefer to do Misery Mire before doing the Ice Palace, since that block puzzle I mentioned at the end can be skipped, and that block puzzle was awful. Beyond the items you get from big chests, a few items are required to beat the game that you need to get outside of palaces, like the Zora Flippers for swimming through the Swamp Palace, the Ether and Quake medallions, and the Book of Midoriya are a few examples. Making the palaces rely on items that require you to explore the overworld to get makes the game feel a lot less linear. You can pick up the flippers long before you'll actually need them for the Swamp Palace, and it's cool to need out-of-palace items to complete the game. Also, for the sake of the game world, it's a nice touch to have so many of these palaces be accessible, but not progressible without a specific item. You can go into Misery Mire without the hookshot, but you won't be able to get past the first room. Same thing goes with the Cane of Samaria and Turtle Rock. I actually like that touch a lot. It makes the palaces feel more a part of the world to me. Turtle Rock is always around and you can go to it. You just can't get past the first room. It makes these places feel like they're a part of the world and not just some bad guy's cave you gotta dive into. Speaking of Turtle Rock, that is a really solid palace. I liked the multiple paths and the creative use of items. I think the Ice Palace sucks. I mentioned that you can skip the block puzzle using the Cane of Samaria, but if you don't skip that puzzle, you'll be frustratingly backtracking through the palace in a specific way to solve it, and that is just a headache I never want to deal with. I actually like the third palace a lot. While I do hate Moldorm, the concept of falling between floors introduced in the Tower of Hera is really neat. And that idea is used in most of the Dark World palaces, and I think it adds a sort of 3D-ness to the game, which goes a little underappreciated. Instead of falling into a bottomless pit on the third floor, you just fall down a floor. And that just makes so much sense, and I love it. The palaces are fairly unique in design, and while the puzzles are never anything complicated, I appreciated the focus on making the navigation through the palaces the challenge instead of individual puzzles. And needing items from the overworld to progress makes the world feel more connected. I really enjoy the palaces in A Link to the Past. For the most part, they were really good. Side quests mostly consist of walking objects to and from a location. The blacksmith, the box, and the bomb all fall under this category. Some stuff like the fairy upgrades are nice because they're hidden, but the dumping of rupees is egregious at best, but it is also totally optional. Getting the bird is an alright side quest, and beyond that there isn't really anything else that's optional. There's the one side dungeon in Death Mountain, but it doesn't have any bosses and only a handful of rooms to its name. The small moments throughout the game, slapping stakes, jumping down wells, and bombing walls for heart pieces, is great. It's just that all those instances are too short to be considered side quests. And if you want, you can count the fish as a side quest, because I'm all for that fish. Thing is great. Beyond that, you got the visuals, which are really stylized. I like them a lot, actually. The only problems I have are like the guards. I think they look a little weird. Like something about them feels off to me. Might be the eyes. Overall though, I do really enjoy the visual direction that the game has. It's got vibrant colors, distinctive looking environmental doodads, and defined items. You know what items you can interact with, you know what walls you can bomb, and where you can walk, and so on and so forth. It's all visually consistent. The game does lag when there's too much stuff on screen, and even though a lot of games share that problem, it's still a problem. That slowdown will happen throughout the entire game. But beyond that, the art style of the game is clean, charming, and uniquely depicts the world. I'm a big fan of it. The soundtrack of A Link to the Past contains some pretty iconic songs. The refined version of the series theme, Kakariko Village, and the palace music, all of this stuff is great. The downside to it is that these songs aren't that long, so they end up looping a lot. If you start wandering around the overworld for more than 5 minutes, that song is going to have looped at least 3 times. And if you're stuck in a palace, you might as well just mute your TV. Away from the OST, the sound effects are okay. The only reason I'm bringing them up, actually, is because of how absolutely atrocious Zora's waterfall sounds. Maybe it's just on the version I played, but this is basically amplified static. I'm kind of lukewarm on the soundtrack overall. Honestly, when I play the game now, I'm usually listening to a streamer podcast or something and I have it muted. The looping either bothers me or becomes background noise, so I don't feel like I need to listen to it. I don't know, man. Maybe the music just isn't for me. I'm not gonna count it against it, but the looping, it gets to me. After all of that, I still think A Link to the Past holds up as a game. The game lags, the combat isn't deep, the story isn't great, and the cluttering up of the overworld with respawning enemies isn't good either. But the mechanics of movement still work. It doesn't feel bad or awkward to control Link, and the graphics hold up pretty well. The palaces are distinguishable in design and direction, and their focus on navigation is awesome. The overworld has a bunch of places to explore that give some solidly tangible rewards, and there is never a big break in the pacing of the game. And while I think other Zelda titles have more interesting worlds and characters, and catchier music, and more memorable side quests, I do think A Link to the Past really set a high bar for the mechanical core of a Legend of Zelda game. You never have to wait in this game. You get your sword and you go. And after every palace, you just hop back on that metaphorical horse and ride off to the next palace or side quest. There's no long tutorial, no Triforce hunt, no massive backtracking segment. It's always forward, and always at the pace you, yourself, are setting. At its core, A Link to the Past achieves what it sets out to do. It establishes a world, sets up challenges for you to tackle, secrets for you to find, and items for you to mess around with, and does all of this while leaving the pacing of the game entirely up to you. It's hard to argue against that quality that A Link to the Past has. It definitely holds up as far as I'm concerned, and easily earns a spot as one of the best games ever.